Authorize Ukraine to strike targets on Russian soil with long-range weapons they are supplying. This a significant policy change that does come as Ukrainian troops are losing ground in the war. The deputy head of Russia's Security Council expressed outrage Friday, warning this could lead Moscow into a war with NATO. Brian Taylor is a professor of political science at Syracuse University, joining us now to talk more about all of this. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us this morning.
Thank you, Josh.
All right, so first off, can you provide a little bit of clarity on exactly what it is that the U.S. and Germany are allowing Ukraine to do with those weapons?
So this situation arose because of the Russian attack on Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second largest city and only about 20 miles away from the Russian border. And Ukraine could see Russian troops massing, preparing to attack just across the border, and were basically unable to strike back with weapons provided by the U.S. and some of our allies. So what the U.S. and some other countries have decided is that that's not really reasonable to make Ukraine just have to wait and watch, and so they can strike back at areas just across the border with U.S. supplied equipment, hit troop emplacements, military depots, logistics points, those kinds of things.
And my question is, what kinds of weapons are we talking about?
So for the most part, with this specific decision, it has to do with artillery that will allow Ukraine to strike back against targets across the border inside Russia, some types of missiles. But at the same time, the United States has stated that this does not open up to the use of longer range missiles to strike deeper inside Russia. So it is very much about troop concentrations, depots, logistics within, a couple dozen miles of the Ukrainian border inside Russia.
Are there other countries that already do kind of supply weapons to Ukraine without any sort of limits of any kind?
Yeah, the U.S. is actually kind of behind the curve compared to quite a few of our NATO allies in this respect. I was trying to add it up, and I think there are roughly a dozen NATO countries that have said that Ukraine can use the weapons provided to us in legitimate self-defense of its territory. So the restrictions are really only those imposed by international law. They have to be used against legitimate military targets. But other than that, Ukraine is allowed to use them to strike in various points inside Russia by these other countries. And this includes some major countries such as Great Britain, France, Poland, Sweden, and other NATO allies.
This threat by Russia about a nuclear war with NATO and its allies, is that essentially just an empty threat? Will it deter the U.S. and Germany in any way?
I think it's mostly an empty threat. Of course, that's somewhat easy for me to say sitting at home on a Saturday morning. I'm not sitting in the Oval Office having to make these decisions. In some sense, both the U.S. and Russia have been deterred by the presence of nuclear weapons. President Biden, from the very beginning, after the full-scale invasion in February 2022, said that the U.S. will not be providing troops to fight in Ukraine because he didn't want the U.S. and Russia to get in a direct war. At the same time, Russia has avoided striking NATO territory, countries that border Ukraine, where U.S. and other military equipment is flowing into Ukraine. Russia is not hitting out at those countries because I think, regardless of the war that we're in, both the U.S. leader Biden and the Russian leader Putin understand that an escalation to direct nuclear war between the two countries would be catastrophic for both countries. So in that sense, nuclear deterrence is still operating to shape the conflict, and arguably has made the United States maybe a bit slow and hesitant at times to come to the full support of Ukraine.
The war now has been going on for well over 2 years at this point. Where do things stand now? Is there any actual end in sight to the war itself?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, from the point of view Ukraine, this war has been going for more than 10 years now, since Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014 and then sponsored a war in the southeastern part of Ukraine known as the Donbass. But you're right, the full-scale invasion took place in February 2022, a little more than 2 years ago. And I think what we've seen really over the last year and a half is not much movement of the front in either direction. Some limited, very limited Ukrainian gains last summer, some fairly limited Russian gains over the last 6 months or so. But the situation we're in is one in which Russia currently occupies close to 20% of Ukrainian territory, and that's not changing much. In terms of the prospect for a settlement, I would say we're still quite far away because the positions of the two sides are very different. Russian President Vladimir Putin has made clear that he wants to control Ukraine and he wants to eliminate this notion of a separate Ukrainian identity independent from Russia. Of course, Ukraine sees things completely differently. Ukraine says we're a real nation, we're a real country. We're entitled to defend our territory against Russian external aggression. And neither side has moved much on those positions really over the last 2+ years. So in that sense, I don't think listeners should expect this war to be wrapping up anytime soon. And the question really is, what are the U.S. and its allies willing to do to help Ukraine defend itself against this war of territorial aggression against it?
All right, Brian Taylor there at Syracuse University. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and break all of this down. Anything else you want to add before I let you go?
I guess the last thing I would say is, from my perspective, the U.S. has been a bit slow at coming to the defense of Ukraine. I mean, obviously, it's been there from the beginning, but we know that it took around 6 months for the aid package to make its way through Congress. It took the U.S. a bit slow to lift some of, it was a bit slow on the U.S. part to lift some of these restrictions. And I think Ukraine is quite entitled under international law to defend its territory, including by striking the territory of the country that's attacking it, which is Russia. So I welcome this U.S. decision, and I think the U.S. should continue to stand up for the principle of territorial integrity in the 21st century in Europe.
All right, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and break it all down. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh.